All right, let's go ahead and get started. I am Professor Kent Lee from the Center for Teaching and Learning, and today I'm going to talk about motivation and learning habits. Now, maybe you can think of a time in your college experience when you were really motivated to learn something. Now, how did that affect your performance? Did you do well when you were really motivated? It sounds obvious, but yes. And if you're not motivated, are you likely to do well? Probably not, but why is that? How does that work? Why is it, this is a psychological question, why is it that when you're motivated, you're going to do better? Any ideas how that works? How does motivation affect your learning and your performance? Any ideas?
Because you work harder.
Okay, you work harder. That's a good reason. You work harder, but also you probably work better. You have better study habits, better learning habits, and we'll talk about that today. We're going to talk about motivation and types of motivation. It not only matters how motivated you are, but what kind of motivation you have, because there are different kinds of motivation, and some kinds of motivation work better than others. And the kind of motivation you have relates directly to how you study and how well you study. So we'll talk about study habits, good study habits, of people who have good types of motivation, and weaker kinds of study habits. And also what happens when your motivation goes awry, when it goes wrong, when it malfunctions, when you completely lose motivation, or you have a really unhealthy kind of motivation, which is a problem for college students. And finally, we'll talk about finding your motivation, how to think about your motivation, and maybe think about how to improve it or where to go for some help. So what is motivation? Well, you could say that it's really a combination of several different psychological factors. It's your expected benefits, what you expect to get out of it. How motivated are you? That's going to relate to, really, are you expecting to get something good out of it? Are you expecting something worthwhile? Or do you do it just because you have to? You have to study. How important is that to you? What you're doing, what you're studying, and the expected benefits, is it really important to you personally? And some common problems for college students is they try to motivate themselves when they really don't see the personal importance of what they're trying to study. And the third thing is attainability. Is it something you can really accomplish with a reasonable amount of work? And again, that's where some college students have problems. They think that no matter how hard I try, I can't succeed, and it's kind of hopeless. So we'll talk about some of these problems. Now, will it help if you go hear a motivational speaker? You know, one of these speakers that tries to give you what we call a pep talk, like an enthusiastic talk to make you pepped up, make you enthusiastic, like, yeah, I'm going to do it. Does that help? Next. A motivational speaker, like, yeah, I'm going to do well, I'm going to do it. Does that help you, really? For a few people, but usually not for most people. Why is that? Motivational speakers, motivational self-help books, do those really work? No, because there is really little substance. There is little substance. They don't really understand how the brain works, how the mind works, and what really needs to change. And so any change you feel might be a simple, temporary, emotional, superficial kind of enthusiasm that goes away. What about telling yourself motivational messages? Yeah, I'm going to get 100 on that exam tomorrow. I'm going to get 100. I'm going to get 100. Does that work? No. It doesn't really do anything to change your study habits. And it actually may raise your expectations. And so when you don't get 100 and you get a 90 or an 80, it makes you feel worse. You've raised your expectations and you haven't met them, and it can make you feel worse. And that's the danger. How about motivational posters? Yeah. It may be hard to see, but this says motivation. Motivational poster. And at the bottom it says, if a pretty poster and a cute saying are all it takes to motivate you, you probably have a very easy job. the kind of job that robots will be doing soon. Okay. So these posters don't help, but next one, this is one of my favorites. Courage. I know it possibly can't work, but I want to do it anyway. Keyword, okay. These are cute, but they don't necessarily help. So next one. So we're going to talk about types of motivation. And there are kind of two dimensions. One kind of motivation is what we call intrinsic or internal motivation and extrinsic motivation. And that's kind of one dimension. That's on your notes. Intrinsic, extrinsic. And there's a similar dimension of what's called learning and performance. And the learning motivation often goes along with the intrinsic, and the performance often goes along with the extrinsic. So I'm going to refer to my handout for a while here. So the intrinsically motivated student is the student who wants to learn. They actually have a sort of passion to learn. It may be out of pure intellectual interest in the subject, like I just love this stuff, I like studying this, or it's a desire to really master the content because, you know, I want to be the best mathematician that I can be, I want to be the best scholar in this field I want to be, or I want to master this so I can be really the best engineer that I can be. Those who have a sort of internal, intrinsic interest in the subject, you actually like the subject and you see a lot of personal value in it for you. That is intrinsic motivation. That relates to the learning motivation, where you learn because you want to learn. You really want to learn. You're really interested in the stuff and you really want to master the material. At the opposite end is the extrinsic learner. An extrinsic learner is mainly seeking some kind of a reward, an external reward. So the motivation is not really in here, but it's out there. It's maybe getting good grades, getting good test scores, getting a good job, getting admission to a good university or a good graduate school. It's something kind of more material, not so much driven from within, but from without. And that relates to a kind of performance motivation, where you're focusing not on the learning, but on the performance. You want to look good for yourself, and maybe so that your classmates don't see you fail. You don't want to screw up. You don't want to fail. You don't want other people to see you fail. You want to look good. You want to perform well, to look good, and so that other people will be happy with you. That's a performance motivation. So on one side, you've got the extrinsic learning kind of motivation. The other side, there's the extrinsic and performance kind of motivation. Now, which kind of student is going to do better? The intrinsically motivated student is going to do better. And in a minute, we're going to look at the study patterns, the study habits that are different between the intrinsic and the extrinsic learner. Finally, there is also the sort of demotivated student. We'll come to that kind of person later. The demotivated student, or amotivated, is the person who has lost all motivation, who has given up, who is discouraged and doesn't want to try anymore. And that's actually not unusual for college students. It might be simply a short-term burnout, or it could be a longer-term kind of situation that makes it really hard to study and to succeed and to do well. So we're going to talk, and that's characterized by things like depression, discouragement, learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is where the student basically feels helpless and acts helpless. They give up and they don't respond to encouragement. They don't respond to feedback on their work or feedback from professors. They will actually avoid trying in some ways. They will basically try to protect themselves by avoid trying and avoid taking risks where they might fail and look bad. And that's the demotivated person. So let's move on to the study habits. Does that remind you of yourself? Overwhelmed by a bunch of books? Well, some people may feel that way sometimes. There are actually helpful study habits and not so helpful study habits. So next slide. So we'll talk about the intrinsic and extrinsic students in terms of things like self-awareness, and what we call planning strategies and conceptual learning, your reading and writing skills, your goals, your feedback, the sort of affective or emotional attitude, motivation type aspects. So what are some features of intrinsically good students? Well, intrinsically motivated students happen to have better study habits, more successful study habits than the extrinsically motivated students. So we can read the various study strategies on the handout starting on page 3. And I won't go through all of them, but you can read some of these later. But usually an intrinsically motivated student has a repertoire or a collection of very successful strategies. And it may be different for different people. People with different intellectual talents and interests and abilities, and also the way their mind or brain works. Different people will have different repertoires of strategies that work for them. But some of the typical ones I'll kind of talk about. The first one is self-awareness. Basically, that means as a learner, you are very self-aware of your abilities, your strengths, but also your limitations. You know your limitations. You try to take on challenges, but you don't overdo it because you do know your limitations. You know what you cannot reasonably do. So you push yourself because you want to learn, but not to an unreasonable extreme. The extrinsically motivated student will tend to have a limited self-awareness, so they may push themselves too hard and try to work under very unrealistic expectations and take on things that they cannot handle and fail as a result. Or the extrinsically motivated learner might simply set lower goals because they're easier. The demotivated student will probably avoid as much as possible that because they focus so much on their limitations that they have an unrealistic sense of their limitations, that they don't have any confidence in themselves. Planning strategies, so good learners have good planning strategies. They plan out their study time, how much effort they're going to study, on what subject, how they're going to spend their time, what kinds of methods they're going to use to study and to learn. And they're going to set good priorities and goals, reasonable priorities and goals. They're going to use things like rehearsal strategies. So like when you're studying, you kind of also rehearse things in your mind. You kind of go over in your mind what you've been learning, reading so far. And after a study session, you also kind of do more mental rehearsal. In your mind, you kind of again go over the things you've learned and try to make more connections, try to understand it more deeply. That's kind of rehearsal. You kind of mentally rehearse the information. Some people like to rehearse it aloud, and that's okay if you don't have roommates. Visualization, you kind of visualize what you're learning and reading. Conceptual learning, this is really a big difference. Intrinsically motivated learners focus more on learning concepts. They're trying to learn concepts, ideas, and how things are connected to each other. And all the materials that they've got, they're trying to understand the main ideas and how ideas are connected and how things relate, and the implications of these ideas or concepts. The extrinsically motivated student will tend to focus too much on the details than the facts, and they'll get lost in an ocean of information. The intrinsically good, motivated learner with the good study habits will try to make predictions. For example, when they're reading, when they're studying, they're trying to make predictions. Okay, where is this going? Where is the author of this book going with this line of thought? Tries to make hypotheses or guesses about the meaning, tries to make inferences about how things connect, and about implications. Okay, this is neat, but how does X apply to maybe situation Y? And they try to think predictively about things like that. Reading and writing skills. Students with good learning habits look really different in their reading and writing skills. Have you ever taken a speed reading course? You ever taken a speed reading course? Do you need to? No. Because good learners actually learn by themselves what are essentially speed reading skills. We call skimming and scanning. Skimming is when you kind of go quickly through a text and look for the main ideas. That's one kind of study strategy. Or scanning, if you're going through quickly to look for a particular piece of information. That's basically like speed reading. You don't need to pay money for a class. A lot of successful college students basically learn that kind of skill by themselves to speed up time, because that's a time saver. You don't need to read everything, maybe in a textbook. You can skim some things, you can focus on what's more important and pay less attention to the less important things. Some people will maybe skim through a chapter first and get the main ideas, then go back and read for the contents, the important stuff. How about reading in English? How many of you try to look up every word as you go along? Is that a good idea? No. Because it distracts you from the contents, the ideas. So really what a more successful learner will do is quite different from what a more extrinsically motivated learner will do. An extrinsically motivated learner may focus too much on the details. So when they're reading and they encounter new words that they don't know, they'll try to look up every word the first time. The better readers, including readers in a second language, like English in your case, will avoid too much dictionary lookup. So if you get stuck on this, maybe a better thing to do is this. If you've got a textbook, maybe the first time you're reading the chapter, maybe you just want to skim through and get the main ideas. And then maybe go through again and actually read it more carefully for the contents, understanding the contents, without worrying about the English, without worrying about vocabulary and new words. When possible, guess new words from context. More successful learners will guess the meaning of words from context when possible. So read one time just focusing on the contents, not worrying about the English or the new words, the words you don't know. Read at least once focusing on just the ideas, the contents, not the English. Then you can go back, and if you need to, look up keywords, maybe not every word, but keywords, things like technical terms that you can't get from the context. You can go through after you've read through for the contents. So read the contents, then go back and look up keywords, and then go back and read it again if possible. After you've done lookup, read it again, and then put everything together, the new words and the contents. And that might be a more helpful strategy. And as you're going through reading a chapter, the better readers are going to kind of, look at the chapter and probably think, okay, what are probably the main ideas in this chapter? What are the things I need to look for? How does this idea connect with what was on the previous page or the previous section? How do these connect with maybe what my professor talked about last lecture? Is this really important stuff? Do I need to focus on this, or is this something I can skip? So good readers are going to think about the concepts and making connections between ideas and concepts. Another thing is, we can go to the next slide. I'll talk about memory devices in a minute, but rote learning. Rote learning is mechanical learning. You mechanically try to memorize everything, and that's actually not helpful. A good learner is going to focus on concepts and ideas. And yes, there are sometimes facts and details you have to remember, but the less successful learner is going to focus too much on details and facts and try to memorize them. When you try to mechanically memorize things, that's rote learning. So the less successful learner is going to get lost in details, lost in all the facts, and trying to memorize a bunch of facts. The successful learner is going to mainly focus on the ideas. And if you understand the ideas and the concepts, then it's easier to remember details and facts. And the successful learner is not going to try to learn all of the details and the facts, but what are probably the more important ones. Unfortunately, maybe your educational background has taught you to be a rote learner. For example, the way you learned English, which is very sad. You had to memorize a lot of vocabulary. You had to memorize a lot of grammar rules. And there's no chance for real practice, for real use of English. And if you came to my talk before, I might have shared this example. For example, I'm on the street here, and some high school teenage boys want to talk to me in English, but they don't really know how. They've probably learned English for many years, but they don't know how to speak it. And they come up to me and say, "Hi, I like kimchi, I love you," and they giggle and run away, because they haven't really learned English properly. It's all been rote learning. So you try to push facts into your brain by rote learning, by mechanically learning, but that's not how the human brain works. The human brain can learn facts when you learn them in connection with concepts and context, a meaningful context. So if you just try to learn by rote, by memorizing mechanically, your brain is not going to keep much of it, or not for a long time. You try to push it into your brain, and your brain will push most of it out. And that's the way the human brain works. And so this rote learning is not very successful. And this is something that psychologists have known for many, many decades, and sometimes the word hasn't gotten out, that mechanical learning is not successful. Better learners are going to focus more on the concepts and then the more important details, and not get lost in all of the details and all the facts. Sometimes more successful learners are going to use mnemonics. Mnemonics are memory devices or memory tricks. Maybe next. Do you know Roy G. Biv? It's a name you might want to know, especially if you're in science. Next slide. These are the colors of the rainbow, or the colors of the color spectrum. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Roy G. Biv. Next one. Or if you're in North America, you need to know the names of the Great Lakes between Canada and North America. Holmes. So Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, Superior. Those are simple mnemonics. Next. Word associations, especially for dealing with the English. Or in my case, I'm trying to learn Korean. So recently I learned the word kaul, meaning mirror, right? So how do I remember kaul for mirror? I imagine myself standing in front of the mirror, and I say, "Cool." And I draw it out, "Cool, kaul, kaul," okay? That's a simple word association. Or I learned German as a second language, and then one time I tried Hebrew for a little bit before I got too busy. So I learned the word Schulahan for table or desk, and to me it sounds like Schule, which is German for school, and Han, which is German for chicken. So I just picture a school room with a chicken on a desk, and I learned Schulahan. That's one of the few Hebrew words I remember. Okay, next slide. Is pi on the screen? Is that pi? Background, okay. So remember, 3.14159. 26535 8979 3238 264 337 3297. Is that more or less right? Do you know when I learned that? I did it yesterday. Started learning that yesterday. How? I used mnemonic tricks. Next slide. There are books like this, the references in your notes. This or other books will teach you kind of these mnemonic tricks I used to learn pi yesterday. You can also use these same tricks for memorizing lists of items, lists of things. Very helpful. I've used them since middle school biology when my teacher made us memorize huge amounts of stuff for a test. What's on the next slide? Oh yes, yeah, we're learning. So this is an exercise. So if you use memory tricks, you can save a lot of time. Then you can focus on the more important details in your learning and spend less time memorizing stuff. It's really helpful. What about writing? Writing or the major presentations. A common problem for students is they get stuck in a sea of an ocean of information. They don't know how to organize it. So maybe for writing or other major assignments, you need to find some kind of technique that works for you. Now, me personally, I just get the information and I go straight to writing an outline. And from the outline, I create my essay or presentation or whatever. That might work for some of you. Other people maybe need to brainstorm. You just write out whatever ideas come to mind. and then organize it graphically, what we call a graphic organizer, things like mind maps, concept maps, flow charts, and then from there go to writing the essay, or from your chart, your graph, go to an outline and then go to an essay. Sometimes students maybe make the mistake of trying to take on a topic that's too big, and they need to focus on something that's more specific and manageable. So you might find yourself having trouble getting started because you picked a topic that's too big, or you don't have enough information, or you have too much information and you don't know what to do with it. In terms of goals, your learning goals, intrinsically motivated students, better students, are going to have kind of longer range goals. The extrinsically motivated student will have shorter range goals. The extrinsically motivated student wants to maybe cram. Cram is like you do a lot of rote memorization maybe the day before the test. They cram all the information into the brain so they can get a good score in the test and then go on. The better student is going to focus more on long-term learning, not just memorization, but long-term learning, because they realize, I need to know this not only for the exam, but I need to keep this next year for my next course, or for when I graduate and I get a job. I still need to remember this. I need to really understand this, not memorize this, but I really need to understand this. So the better learners have longer-term learning goals, and they set more realistic goals that are more attainable. They do seek challenges to really push them and make them learn, but not unrealistic challenges. They understand their limitations and what they can do. So they're more likely to be persistent and not give up. There's a difference in terms of how they handle things like feedback and mistakes. The better learner doesn't mind making mistakes sometimes because you actually learn from making mistakes. And that's maybe different from the way you were raised, but really psychologically speaking, you know that you learn from making mistakes sometimes. And a good learner is going to actually take feedback and use it and say, oh, the teacher pointed out these things, okay, I'm going to learn from this, I'm going to try to improve based on the feedback. The less successful student is going to say, oh, this isn't fair. They're going to take it personally, like, oh, gee, the teacher thinks I'm a bad student. No, that's not what the teacher means. The teacher's trying to give you specific feedback on what you need to do, what you need to improve. So there's a difference in how they handle feedback. Finally, there's a difference in terms of other attitude or affective factors. Things like what we call efficacy, or your sense of effectiveness as a learner. Students who have a sense of efficacy or effectiveness have a sort of confidence or trust in their abilities, and they know their abilities and what they can and cannot do. They believe that I'm a good learner, and if I work reasonably hard, I can expect to do reasonably well. And that is something that comes from maybe learning and mastering content, and also from maybe role modeling, seeing their role modeling, imitating successful professors, classmates who are good students, maybe encouragement that they get from professors and other people, but especially from mastering the content. They have a good sense of their ability to study hard and to do well and succeed. And that's something that less successful students might lack. Also, ambiguity tolerance. Ambiguity tolerance for ambiguity or uncertainty. So if you don't understand something in a class or in learning English, do you give up and just move on? Or do you really try to say, I'm going to keep trying to understand this, maybe I'll just put this on hold and I'll come back to this later, and I believe I can understand this, I just need to come back to it later. I don't mind if I don't understand something. The better learner is better able to handle uncertainty. Like, when you don't understand something, you won't get so discouraged. You'll just say, I'm going to keep trying to understand this, or I'll put this on hold, I'll go on to something else, then I'll come back to this later, and I think later I can understand this. That's ambiguity tolerance. Whereas other learners will say, oh, I give up, this is hopeless, I can't understand this, I will simply go on. Which is not a good study strategy, because maybe you need to understand this before you can understand the next stuff. So finally, there is the demotivated person. I think there's another slide here. Okay, study habits, I think we talked about that. Yes, the demotivated person is like Homer, who says trying is the first step towards failure. Okay, so the demotivated person may have actually been broken by maybe system or circumstances that are stacked against him or her. They feel helpless, they feel like whatever they do is hopeless, there's no point. They will think, oh, the teacher just hates me. They will misunderstand the negative feedback from the teacher and think, oh, the teacher just hates me. The teacher doesn't like me, the teacher isn't fair, and there's nothing I can do to study. If you think that you're in this kind of state, you really ought to talk to somebody. It is possible to get out of it. It might be short term, like burnout. Maybe you've just burned out and need a break. It might be longer term, and if it's longer term, maybe you should talk to somebody. Because it is possible to recover from this and to learn to be motivated again. Now, this is kind of a spectrum from intrinsic to extrinsic. And you might be extrinsic in some areas, some subjects, and more intrinsic in others. And maybe you can't be intrinsically motivated about everything, but the more intrinsically motivated overall you are, the more successful you will be. In my case, for example, all my life, I thought I didn't like math. And I didn't like math. I thought I was not good at math. I was really good in other things, but when it came to math, I just had this math fear, this math phobia all my life. Then in graduate school, in my PhD program, I had to take statistics, and that was scary. And at first, I didn't know what was going on. There are all these equations, and I couldn't really make sense of them, and this stuff really didn't make sense. And I was working at it very extrinsically. Even though in everything else I'm very intrinsic, when it came to stats, I was very extrinsic. But by the time I got to my fourth statistics course, I started to understand things, and I started to see, oh, this is a neat method. I could apply this to some of my research data. I started to see things differently. Fifth stats course, I was really starting to like this stuff. I was finally starting to understand the stuff, and I realized, oh, I do like math after all. The problem was, back in grade school, I had a really mean math teacher for 3 years who ruined my motivation. She obviously did not like children, and I don't know why she was teaching, but she destroyed my confidence and my desire for math. That affected me all my life until my stats courses in grad school helped me to see things differently. Now I'm not very strong in math. It's a lifetime to catch up on, but I do like the stuff kind of now. I even bought books on like the history of pi and the number pi, not baking pie. So another area where that might be hard for you, though, is the English component of your courses. So you have your different subjects, your different courses where you might be more or less intrinsically or extrinsically motivated. Then you've got the English component, and that can be hard for you. So let's go on to the next slide. There's something called language and cultural identity and social motivation. This is a unique kind of motivation that's kind of like a very special kind of intrinsic motivation. People who are better language learners tend to be the people who have a very strong kind of identity. They develop a sort of a second cultural or language identity. Like, I like this language and I want to use this language. I want to interact with people in this language. I want to identify with this culture. Or similarly, a social motivation. I want to have friends in this that I speak with in this language or in this country. And those tend to be the more successful language learners. And for you, however, unfortunately, English has been kind of forced upon you. You're forced to study it in a very rote way. And so your motivation towards English may be very rote, mechanical, extrinsic. And it may be hard to change that, but another problem is English here has been exclusively American English. And that breeds a certain resentment because, unfortunately, my country has done some very wrong things in the world, and that has bred resentment. And so some people here resist English because they connect it with American imperialism and American foreign policy and such bad things. Well, you don't have, that's really unfortunate because English is not just American. North of my country, there's this lovely country called Canada, very peaceful. They have a healthcare system unlike my country. They don't attack other countries unlike my country. You'll never ever have to worry about Canada attacking you, I promise. Very nice. There's England. Frankly, my favorite TV shows are British TV shows. And there's Australia and such. If you interact with people from other countries, Singapore, Hong Kong, India, Africa, their English is based on British English to some degree or another. Or they have studied British English in schools. Middle East, Europe, they study British English. So it's important to know British. But also not to identify English with just America, but as a world language. And if you identify yourself as a world citizen or as a global citizen or as an international person and think of English that way, then maybe English won't be so scary for you or so negative. And if you can get past the sort of way that English was forced upon you in a very mechanical, rote learning kind of way, and learn to see it as a language, as something you can enjoy, then maybe that would help. Okay, and finally, some of you though probably feel tired when you're using English. There's a certain mental fatigue. If you're using a second language, now that consumes more of your working memory. So do you feel tired or tired after doing work in English than in Korean? Okay, that's because using a second language is more, consumes more of your mental resources, your working memory, and such, whereas your first language is completely automatic. And such, you don't have to use any mental energy to process your Korean. So that may mean you just need to be aware of this and take maybe breaks, study breaks sometimes, do some exercise or such, or try German. No, I don't know. Okay, next slide. Let's talk about what happens when sometimes the motivation goes bad, goes awry. Well, we've talked about, I think next slide, we talked about, well, okay, regret. Let's talk about regret. Sometimes you may feel regret, like, oh, I should have really studied for that exam instead of watching TV. And that's okay, but some people get so stuck in regret that they can't move on. Regret is actually supposed to be a helpful emotion. It's supposed to be a way of learning from your past mistakes. So you're supposed to simply learn from your mistakes, from the regret, and then go on. Change your behavior and then move on and do better. But some people get so stuck on the regret that they are trapped by this sort of spirit of self-accusation, recrimination, hating yourself. Loss of control or learned helplessness. Next slide. Again, Mr. Simpson is like that. You feel like you don't have any control. You feel like you're helpless, you're hopeless, and such. That's characteristic of the demotivated learner. It's also characteristic possibly of depression. So if you regularly feel like this, that could be a sign of depression and you might need to talk to someone because your depression could be related to that. Another thing that you do is rationalizing, and that's a defense strategy you need to be aware of. You don't do well in a course, you say, oh, that wasn't important anyway, or I don't want to learn that anyway. Be careful because you're simply using a defense strategy. That is a psychological defense strategy. And that's not the most healthy way of dealing with problems in a class. Next one is writer's block. Now this could be true of other major assignments, but for example, when you're trying to write an essay, do you get stuck? Like you sit there at the computer screen and it's been an hour and you haven't typed anything? You can't think of anything to write? That's writer's block. You have a block in your writing and you can't really get anywhere. What causes writer's block? It could be perfectionism, which I'll talk about in a minute. It could be other things. It could be, again, you have too much information, you don't have enough information. It could be the topic you picked is too broad, too vague. And that means you can't really go anywhere. You can't organize your thoughts if your topic is too broad. Most often you need to narrow your topics, pick something more specific, get some more information, and then start from there using maybe graphic organizers, outlining, brainstorming skills and such. Sometimes, though, it is because you have internalized negative voices from the past, whether it's with writing or with other things. You might have a block because you have internalized negative voices from the past. In my case with math, it was that mean math teacher I had, that evil math teacher from my grade school, that created a math block for me. And so I never felt confident about math. In fact, I was afraid of math because it was like there is, in the back of my mind, there is this negative voice from that teacher barking at me, "You'll never be good at math. Okay, you're no good." It's a voice that I internalized, and that affected my confidence in math. Likewise with writing or other things. Maybe you had a teacher or a parent or someone in the past who pushed you too hard, who discouraged you, and you've internalized these negative voices. Next slide. So you've got these voices in your head that are saying you won't do any good, or you can't meet these expectations. The expectation is like this, and you can't possibly get there and do a good paper. So, next slide. So you have to say that you will not listen to the voices in your head. I will not obey the voices in my head. Maybe you have to figure out what that is, what the source is, who that was, what it was that discouraged you, and take that voice and kind of strangle it and get rid of it somehow. You need to deal with those negative voices that have discouraged you. Okay, next. Perfectionism. Here's one slide. Next one, too. Yeah, another example of perfectionism. Is perfectionism a good thing? No. Some people will often think that it is. And you may think that it is because it does drive you to work hard and study hard. But think about why you might be perfectionist. Many times, basically, a perfectionist is trying to prove him or herself, his or her worth. Maybe it's because parents or family members pushed you too hard and pushed expectations upon you that were not reasonable, that are not reasonable for you. And so you're trying to prove yourself to past teachers or family members or parents or somebody. You're trying to prove to somebody, I'm worth something, I'm a good person, I'm smart. Rather than accepting yourself, you're trying to prove yourself to someone else. And that at the back of the mind is what is motivating the perfectionist. Or you're trying to prove something to yourself. I'm good enough, I'm worthy of love and respect, or I'm really smart. In grad school, I kind of realized I was a perfectionist. And that's why I took so many courses. I took way too many courses because I wanted to learn everything. Yes, I was very intrinsically motivated, but at the same time I was a perfectionist, and I pushed myself too hard trying to learn everything I possibly could about everything. Because I was trying to meet unrealistic expectations I had about myself. You can never satisfy these expectations. If you get to this far, you'll realize, oh, I made it this far. If I'm really smart, then I should be able to do this. Okay, I get here, if I'm really smart, I should be able to get here. It's a never-ending cycle of trying to prove yourself to somebody. And it's connected with self-esteem problems too. Next slide. You're also trying to avoid failure, fear of failure. Failure of looking like this in front of other people. It's a fear of failure. Next slide. Because sometimes your perfectionism drives you to succeed, but at some point in life, you will find yourself in a situation where no matter how hard you try, you're not succeeding. Maybe it's another class or grad school, maybe it's in a marriage or a job where you just don't understand what's going on. You'll find yourself in a sort of failure mode where you cannot succeed no matter how hard you try. And this will lead to demotivation, this will lead to depression, avoidance strategies, things you do to protect yourself, like procrastinating. Sometimes procrastinating, putting things off, is a defense strategy. You're trying to avoid something that's going to potentially hurt your self-esteem, your sense of worth. You will find yourself in some sort of failure mode where things don't work. That's when you are very susceptible to things like depression or demotivation. So if you are a perfectionist, you have to learn to accept yourself. I read the book by a psychologist on perfectionism, who talks about a patient, a college student, who came to see him, and the student was depressed after getting an A+ in a class. And he says, "Why are you depressed? You got an A+." "Well, I had to work so hard, but if I were really smart, I shouldn't have had to work so hard. You know, like an A+ should have been easier. I shouldn't have had to work so." So it's like an unrealistic expectation. I'm not good unless I have an IQ of 130, or I'm not good enough unless I get a perfect GPA or a near perfect GPA. You're never good enough. The perfectionism is an endless trap. It is an endless emotional trap, and it is harmful for your self-esteem, and it leads to much more extrinsic type of motivation and learning habit, or at least learning habits, study habits that are much more extrinsic or less successful. So if you are a perfectionist or if you are burned out and such, you might need to talk to somebody, especially if it's causing problems for you. Even burnout. One time in college I burned out. Not surprising in college, being the perfectionist I am. I took course loads of anywhere from 16 to 21 hours a semester. And at one point I burned out. How did I get over it? Well, I went to the library at Purdue and studied with my Asian friends, Chinese American, Korean American, and they were really hard studiers. So I got back into my study routine just by joining a group of students. They weren't classmates, but they were fellow college students, and just being with them helped me to study hard again. But you might need to get into maybe a study group of classmates. In fact, maybe the next slide, in terms of finding your motivation, I put this group kind of circle here because sometimes joining a group of classmates might help you to gain some of your motivation, or finding a peer tutor, or someone to talk to you. I think after the end, someone from CTL will talk to you about the services that the CTL offers. You might need to think about why you're a perfectionist. What made you a perfectionist? If you're demotivated, you need to think about what is it in your past that broke your motivation, that broke you emotionally. Was there someone or something in your past that really broke your spirit, that broke your emotions, and turned you into a perfectionist or into a demotivated student? So you might even need to talk to somebody. So those are some things, and I've got some questions at the end of this handout. I've also got a description of MBTI types. I think many of you have taken the MBTI. That's also helpful to know your MBTI and what that means for your learning preferences or learning style. MBTI, by the way, is a test about preferences, what you like. It is not about ability. Some people use it as a test of ability. It is not a test of ability. It is a test of preferences. And you can read this on your own. But, for example, introvert, extrovert. If you're an introvert, you might like to study alone, learn alone. You might like traditional classroom learning where you do things by yourself. And that's cool. I'm an introvert, and introverts are cool. But you may need to discover the joy of group learning, joining a study group, doing things in groups too. Intuitive sensing. If you're intuitive, you might like abstract kind of thinking. And that's cool. If you're sensing, you might like more hands-on or experimental kind of stuff. So it's good to know just what your preference is, what your style is. Thinking and feeling. Some people are more logical, analytical thinkers, and that's cool. Some of you are more feeler types. If you're a feeler type, you probably need more encouragement from people in order to, for your self-esteem or your motivation. But the neat thing is, if you're a feeler type, you can also be the sort of person who can actually give encouragement to your classmates, who can help your classmates and encourage them. If you are a judging or perceiving person, the judging people are better decision makers, but they tend to be more impatient because they tend not to like ambiguity. Whereas the perceiving people, they're okay with ambiguity. They like ambiguity tolerance. And that's an advantage that they have. At the end, I've kind of got some questions about your study habits. If you have writer's block, what are the sources, likely sources of your writer's block? Number 4, do you have a sense of efficacy? If not, why? Are you good at planning and prioritizing your study habits and your study time? Other things like under motivation. What kind of person do you want to be in the future? What kind of person do you think you should be 5, 10 years from now? What kind of person do you want to be? Not just what job you want to be doing, but what kind of person do you want to be? Because that says something about what's important to you, your important values. And it says something about your kind of motivation. Why do you want to be that kind of person? What kind of person do you think you should be, do you want to be in 5 or 10 or 20 years? And what does it say about what's important to you, about your values and about your motivation? That's an exercise you can do at home, reflection exercise. If you're a perfectionist, what made you a perfectionist? Was it all because people pushed you too hard? People communicated to you that you're not worth something unless you succeed? In that case, you have to let go of that and accept yourself and not be chained down by unhealthy expectations from other people. Do you accept yourself? Can you accept yourself as a person and accept your limitations and your strengths? Or is your perfectionism getting in the way? Those are some things to think about. Other things to think about in terms of your values and your motivation. What kind of things do you think about the most? Like when you daydream, when you think about your future, what do you think about the most? Because that says something about what's important to you in your life. What is really your life about? What are your main goals in life and your main values, the most important values and motivations? When you think about what you think about the most during your free time, that says something about that. Do you feel like you're in control of your life? If you do, that's good. If you feel like I'm not in control of my life, I'm not in control of my learning, I feel helpless, that's a sign of demotivation or maybe depression. And that's something to be concerned about. Do you have expectations of yourself that are reasonable? Where do your expectations come from? Your expectations need to be well thought out and reasonable. And you need to, like I said, accept yourself. And I would hope that maybe, at least in some ways, you can become more intrinsically motivated and that you can learn to accept yourselves more and not be chained down by perfectionism. Because in my case, perfectionism, I know, really hurt me in my past. And I've learned to get over some of my perfectionism, and my life is happier, and also my wife is happier. Because I'm at home more. I'm not working like a slave, like I did in grad school. I'm at home more on weeknights and weekends, and my wife is happier. So guys, an important principle, if your wife is happy, your life will be happy. Happy wife, happy life. Important message for you guys. And if you're a perfectionist, that could be a real problem for your future family life, and your personal life, and your sense of self-esteem. So finally, I think you can learn to enjoy studies. Getting good grades, that's nice, but getting good grades is not going to make you happy. Getting a good job will not make you happy. Getting a good TOEFL or TOEIC score is not going to make you happy in life. There are really more important things in life that can make you happy. And if you let go of those kinds of things, I think you can be happier and you can enjoy your studies more. And when you enjoy your studies more, you let go of those wrong expectations, enjoy your life, enjoy your studies more, then you can be a better learner. You can be a better student. So good luck to you.